There he is. Hit that unmute.
Test.
It's good. I hear you. Thanks for joining us today, sir.
Yeah, I feel like we're back on our Userscape one-on-ones here.
I know. It's just you and me. It's just you and me.
Yeah.
I like that hoodie.
Thanks. It's a unique low hoodie. You have any other stuff?
We don't have any around us.
Yeah. I got it online, actually.
Use the old internet.
Yeah.
Cool, man. All right. Well, I'm going to let you take it away and tell us about Laravel 5.8.
Okay.
All right.
So you go ahead and share here. All right.
Yep.
Am I live or what?
Live.
All right, cool. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for coming to Laracon Online 2019. And thanks to Ian and the Userscape crew for organizing the event. And also shout out to our gold sponsors, Linode and Vulture. Check those guys out. They provide fast VPS servers. Works great with Laravel Forge, and sponsors like them make this event possible for us. So we're kind of just coming off a big week in Laravel. We had the Laravel 5.8 release recently, and some of you may remember the kind of winter releases, you might say, used to be, I believe, in December. And we actually purposefully moved those releases to February to actually be closer to Laracon Online. And because that gives us a conference at both releases. So for the winter release, we have Laracon Online. And for the summer release, it's typically around Laracon US and Laracon EU. Typically, I'd kind of demo the new features at Laracon US, and the actual release happens at Laracon EU. So that is why we're on this release schedule, and it is every 6 months, which most people probably know by now, but just in case. And I was actually just looking at the release notes and sort of our versioning policy for Laravel recently. Some of you may have noticed that the next summer release, which would be 5.9, would be an LTS. It's scheduled to be an LTS, which we have every 2 years. So the last one was 5.5, as you can see, on August 30th. And so that would make 5.9 an LTS. There's been, every time I do a release, there's always some comments, about semantic versioning and stuff like that. And that is something that we've kind of tossed around internally. Is historically, Laravel releases, changing the front number was like this big paradigm shifting thing. So from, like, for example, 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, especially 3 to 4, it was sort of this big paradigm shift. And the major version number indicated these huge shifts in how Laravel worked under the hood. And as Laravel has matured, especially in the last, let's say 4 or 5 years since 5.0, which looks like was February 4th, 2015, we just don't really have those kinds of monumental shifts anymore. I think because the framework has kind of settled out and stabilized, and the way it works now around the container and with service providers at the heart of the framework is sort of solid and feels good. And so it just seems really unlikely that we would have those kinds of paradigm shifting changes internally, barring some paradigm shifting change in PHP itself, which, doesn't seem to be on the near horizon, at least. So we've actually talked internally about, going to semantic versioning. And there's some, I think, a little confusion about that, where people think if Laravel adopted semantic versioning, that the upgrade process would be faster or easier, or that it would change in any way, which it wouldn't. The only thing that would actually change is in your composer file, every 6 months, instead of doing 5.8 to 5.9, you would do something like 6.0 to 7.0. But everything else really stays the same. It's really just a matter of it's sort of consistent with other libraries. It's even more consistent with other libraries within Laravel itself. like Nova and Spark and Cashier and Echo and Homestead. Those all follow semantic versioning. I think not following it was sort of actually beneficial earlier in the framework because it allowed for kind of better branding and marketing and hype around, these big new releases, and everyone was excited. And it also was good because since the framework was changing so fast, the learning materials, it was helpful for them to be, labeled like Laravel 4 or Laravel 5 because there were significant differences. But as the framework has matured, it could be argued that the major version number is becoming less important, and that going from Laravel 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, kind of like you see, React 16 or Angular 7, 8, 9, it's getting less important, and we shouldn't put so much emphasis around the major version anymore. So we'll see. Anyway, that was a kind of a long digression around versioning, but this summer in theory would be 5.9, and we'll see what we decide on the semantic versioning thing. Could be a 6.0, but that does not indicate, all that to say, it doesn't indicate that if there was a 6.0, it would necessarily be some huge paradigm shifting change. It may just be sort of a versioning scheme change. All right. So Laravel 5.8. So for this talk, I kind of wanted to walk through some of the new features in the framework, just kind of demo them to you in real code, just so you can see them illustrated a little more versus the documentation, and kind of walk through them. Also, I do have this latest speaker questions tab open here. So at the end of the talk, if I have a few minutes, I'll try to field some of these questions. So go ahead and throw some out there if you have one, so that at the end of the talk, I can just hop over to that tab and I'll see any that kind of look interesting. So first things first, Laravel has a new relationship type, which is the first new relationship type in a while, probably since polymorphic relations. And it's the has one through relation. This is not actually a relation that I have reached for or thought about very often. It does exist in other frameworks, like Rails has one through relation. It mainly serves, I think, as kind of a shortcut. So in this example, we have three models. We have a supplier, which has an account, and an account has one account history. So supplier has an account has an account history, supplier account history. And the way the tables look is, of course, you have a suppliers table, which doesn't have any kind of foreign keys in it in this example. We jump to the accounts table, and we have a supplier ID there, since an account belongs to a supplier. If we jump to account history, we have an account ID, since an account history belongs to an account. So, and then if we look at the models, if we look at supplier, you see it has one account. Let's ignore the has one through for now. If we look at account, we'll see it has one history and belongs to a supplier. If we look at account history, it's just empty. That's kind of the end of the chain for this example. All right. Now, normally, if we wanted to get to the account history from a supplier, we would have to kind of find the supplier and then do account and then account history, something like that, sort of a step through them one at a time. With has one through, you can kind of skip that middle step, so that the end goal is that you can basically just do supplier account history and skip the account model altogether. And so what that looks like in the model side is we have an account history method defined and a has one through. And this first argument is sort of the, the end goal of what we're trying to get to, the end model, which is account history, and we're going through the account model. So that's what those two arguments mean. And then, so in this example, we can just create a supplier real quick, attach an account to it right here on lines 36 through 38, attach a history to the account on line 40 through 42. And then I'm just going to use the has one through to jump to that account history, update it, save it to the database, and return the history. So pretty simple example. I'm going to refresh my database. And if we hit this route, make that a little bigger, has one through, we get the account history, and we can see the total revenue is 200, like we would expect. So pretty cool little relationship if you have that situation in your system where you kind of have a chain of has one relationships. You can use this to kind of make it a little easier to either eager load or access those relationships. All right, so that's the has one through relationship, new in Laravel 5.8. One of my favorite features in Laravel 5.8 is the auto discovery of model policies. And this was something that I had actually tweeted out about months ago, that I was building a new application in Laravel in preparation for Laracon this summer. And it was sort of the main annoying part of the framework I was running into, was having to, or I was mainly forgetting to go register my new authorization policies. So an authorization policy is basically a class that determines if a user can perform some action. And whenever you create one using Artisan Make Policy, you have to remember to come into this auth service provider, or used to have to remember at least, and put it in this array right here of policies where it maps this model associated with this policy, blah, blah, blah. So if you don't do that, you don't really get any particular descriptive error. You just, the authorization fails with like a false, because the gateway or the auth gateway will check for a policy or a ability named whatever you pass, say view or create. It won't find a policy that matches that model, so it will say, okay, I guess this is denied. So it usually took me a minute or two to remember, oh, I forgot to go register in the auth service provider. So now there's sort of a convention for these where by default, if you have a model that you pass to the gate, so right here I'm saying, can the current user that's logged in view this supplier? So what it will do is say, okay, I see that this model is called supplier. Is there a supplier policy class that's in a policies namespace one level deeper than this model? So it basically would match the default Laravel layout. So you can see I have a supplier here in the app namespace. So it will say, okay, is there an app policy supplier policy? In this case, yes, there is, which it returns true that the user can view this policy. And it will say, okay, this must be the policy they mean. So it's just sort of a standard convention for finding them that works with the default Laravel layout. So if I log into this application, because if I'm not logged in, I'll definitely get false, and I hit this model policies route, I get true that it was, I was authorized. So that actually hopefully saves you a lot of frustration. If I was running into it myself, creating the framework, I was running into it fairly often, then I feel like certainly other people were definitely running into it pretty often as well. And it actually can take a little while to debug if it doesn't come to mind pretty quickly that that's what you've done. Because as far as you know, for some reason you're not authorized and you have no idea why. So when I first released this feature, I totally anticipated that people would want to customize where the policies are found, mainly because some people choose to make a models directory here under app, which I may address later if I have time in this presentation. But they'll make a models directory there in the app and put all their models there. And so in that case, they would have sort of like this setup, a models with like a flight model. Say I run an airline company, Lara Flights or something. And then I have my policies are not under here. They're back up one directory and then in policies, flight policy. So the typical out of the box convention would not actually work. So what I did was I defined this or built this method called guess policy names using and let you pass a closure, which is sort of my favorite pattern for deferring responsibility to the user. Is we accept a closure that all it's responsible for is accepting the model that we're trying to find a policy for, the string model class name, and returning the policy class name for that model. And you can use any convention you want at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. And I'm actually going to comment this out just to show you that if we didn't have this, it would actually fail authorization because it wouldn't be able to find the policy. So this should return false, which it does. Now, if we have our custom policy finder, in this case, we get a model class. We say, okay, our policies are in app policies, the base name of the model class, which this class underscore base name is not a built-in PHP function. It's actually a Laravel helper that's probably very rarely used outside of the core. But what it does is if you have a string like app foo user, something like that, and you call class base name on that string, you'll get back user. So it just gives you like the last segment of the class name. But it's actually used fairly often in Laravel itself, even though I would almost never reach for it in my application code. So I'll say that if I get, for example, app models flight, my policy would be app policies flight policy. All right, so if that's uncommented, we should be able to run this and get true because it was able to find our policy. So that kind of gives you an example of how you would set up the auto discovery if you're using a models directory. So I wanted to be sure to show that in my presentation because that is a pretty common pattern, it feels like, for people to use that directory. All right, hopping down. So token. This is something a lot of people may not actually know about Laravel, but when you're doing API authentication with Laravel, you don't actually have to use Passport. We do have sort of a simpler API token driver that ships out of the box. And in Laravel 5.8, it now supports hashing your tokens with SHA-256 so that they're stored hashed. And how this works, it's not as nearly as kind of involved as Passport, since Passport supports OAuth 2 entirely. How it works is you just have an API token on your model, and as long as you pass that API token in the authorization header of a request as like a bearer token, it will, and it matches what's in the database, then it will pass validation. So there's no like OAuth clients, there's no like encryption keys or anything like that, like you would normally have with OAuth. It's a much simpler system. If you were building like a very sort of simple API for some internal project and you didn't need full OAuth, this would be a pretty good solution for giving users an API token and letting them access the system without using their password, without a lot of trouble and without installing any other packages. So how it works is you have an API token out on your users table. So you can see I've got a token there. And in this route, we're actually going to refresh the token, so to speak. So I'll find that user. I will give it a new API token, which is just going to be a random 60-character string. The string random under the hood uses the random, I guess it's random bytes, or one of the new built-in PHP functions to get random, cryptographically secure or random data. So this is not just like a simple sort of string shuffle or anything. It's actually a real, random string built for cryptography purposes. We hash that with SHA-256 and save it in the database. And then we need to inform the user. We don't actually store the unhashed token, but we do need to hold on to it for a second just so we can send it down to the client and show the user kind of like, hey, copy this token because we don't know it and we'll never show it again. And this is your one opportunity to have it, which you may have seen on some other web applications you use. So if we call this token route, let's go ahead and get a fresh token here. All right, so here's our fresh token. Now, again, I'm going to copy that. But again, if I refresh my database, you're going to see that that doesn't actually match the token in the database because it's hashed in the database. But if we come into this REST API client, first I'll make a request with the wrong token. This is an old token. You can see we get unauthenticated. But if I try to hit this API user route, which is just in the default API routes file of Laravel with this token, now I get the user information for my user. So just wanted to demo that because it's sort of a lesser known feature of Laravel that there is actually another way to authenticate APIs out of the box using just a simple token. And now it supports SHA-256 hashing. So there also may be some questions about, what is this actually safe for storing a password versus something like bcrypt? It is, and the reason why it is because there's so much entropy in the 60-character cryptographically secure string that it's really computationally impossible to build a rainbow table and brute force strings of that size. Like to generate all the possible combinations of those strings and their associated hashes would be just like petabytes of data. You couldn't even store that much data, and it wouldn't be computationally possible to crack the password. So it's not actually necessary to use bcrypt when your entropy is so large that it's really impossible to build the rainbow table. All right, so that is API token authentication. Moving right along, pivot models or custom pivot models now dispatch creating, updating, deleted events when you're using attach, sync, detach, stuff like that. So to kind of step through this step by step, first of all, you may not know, but when you have a many-to-many, you don't actually, have to refer to it as pivot in your code. And secondly, you can have a custom model that represents that intermediate table record. So for example, in this situation, a user has many teams or belongs to many teams. So it's a many-to-many relationship. A user can belong to many teams. A team can have many users. And if we look at the user model for teams, you could say I have belongs to many team. And right here, the second argument is the table name. I'm saying this intermediate table has timestamps. And right here is where it gets kind of cool. I can say that I want to use this membership class to actually represent that intermediate table record. And I want to refer to this as a membership, not as pivot when I access it via Eloquent. So I actually have a membership model, and instead of extending the model class, it extends this relations pivot class, which that in turn extends the model class. And you can see I have a dispatches events here on the membership. For when a membership is created, I want you to dispatch this membership created event. All right, so all of that to say that when we attach a team to a user, it will use that model and therefore fire that event when we create that intermediate table record. And that was not the case in Laravel 5.7. There were no events fired, model events. Even if you were using a custom pivot model, they did not fire when you were attaching many-to-many records like this. So there was no way to hook into events around those situations. So the easiest way for me to kind of demo this is actually using Telescope. So I have Telescope installed here. Go to events, and there's no events right now. But when we call this pivots route, we're going to find the user, factory out a team with our model factories, attach the team to the user, and then we'll just return the teams. But we should see an event for that membership created there in Telescope, which I'll go ahead and I guess that's already automatically refreshing. So let's go ahead and hit that route. And you can see, first of all, when we return this, there was no pivot here. We just got membership, and there was no, there's no reference to a pivot. So that kind of shows you that as membership thing, that's how that's working. All right. So now if we go into Telescope, we can see a membership was created. Why do I have 2 events here? Fire that. 3. I don't know why I got 2 there. It's kind of weird. Let's refresh and try this again. 1. Something must have been kind of screwed with my database from when I was messing around with this earlier. But as you can see, we now get a membership created event firing when we attach. And if we detach, we could attach events to that as well. So it gives you a little bit more places to hook in terms of these many-to-many relationships and listen for certain events. So that's a new feature in Laravel 5.8. So around this feature, check that out, but also, take advantage of this ability to use custom models and refer to stuff to sort of give it more expressive names. Like I actually did this in a new application I'm writing where it's just more expressive sometimes to refer to it as something specific that's named after something in your application domain, is not just, arrow pivot and then some attribute. So check that out. That's all documented in the documentation for Eloquent, and give it a shot. All right. Scheduler default time zones. It's kind of a simple one, but pretty nice actually. So to demo this, I'm actually going to jump into my console kernel. So in previous releases of Laravel, that's the internal console kernel. In previous releases of Laravel, if you had a scheduled task, like say we're running the Inspire task every minute, or every hour, every day or whatever, you could specify a time zone so that you could specify a time that makes sense to you. So like if I said, daily at 1300 hours, to me, that's 1 o'clock on Chicago time. Just so it's convenient because you don't have to, convert it to UTC, and then it's easier to read the code for you or your team or wherever you're based, stuff like that. So the problem was, though, in previous releases, you kind of had to do that on every scheduled task. You had to repeat that time zone over and over and over and over if you wanted them all to run at the same time. In Laravel 5.8, you can actually just define a method called scheduled time zone here on your kernel and return your default time zone. And now that will be the time zone used as long as there's not a more explicit time zone specified on the command. So if this is specified, that will be used. If there's a specific time zone on the command, that will take precedence over this default time zone. So it's a really simple thing, but can actually clean up your console kernel a little bit. So you're not constantly having to re-specify that time zone over and over and over and over. All right. Okay, so that was kind of a simple one. There's been some improvements to how you can invoke Artisan programmatically. So in previous releases of Laravel, this is kind of what it looked like, this line 100 right here. You did Artisan call and passed it the command name, for example, migrate, and then you had to pass an array of sort of options here that you wanted to pass to the command. So -- database MySQL, and if it was a command like force that doesn't have any arguments, you would do -- force and then specify that as true. Now in Laravel 5.8, you can actually pass that as one simple string, like you would call it on the command line, which is actually pretty nice. It's just a lot more sort of fluid, and you don't have to jump into an array and wrestle with arguments that way. And if you call this, for example, we'll call the first one to start. It gives you back the exit code. That's the return parameter. So this exited with the exit code of 0, which is successful. If we comment that out, we should see the same exit code, and I'll also dump out the output from that command. So 0 and nothing to migrate because my database is already migrated. So if you're calling Artisan directly using your code of your application, you might want to check that out. It might be a little bit more readable and sort of expressive for you to use this new method of invoking Artisan. All right. Mocking these testing helpers. This is another kind of small life improvement that makes your code a little bit cleaner, a little bit more readable. So to demonstrate this, I've got a route here that /user/any ID. I have a user service, which I'm requesting the container to inject into the route by type pinning it here on the callback. And then I'm going to call the user service to find the user that matches whatever ID is passed in on the request. So the user service, I actually have a contract for here, an app contract called user service, and has the find method. And then I have a database user service implementation that finds that user using Eloquent. So pretty clear style setup where I have a contract for the repository, an implementation for the database layer, and then find the user. And then an app service provider, I'm binding user service to database user service to tell the container, hey, if you need a user service implementation, use the database user service. So really straightforward setup in terms of repositories. Now, if we jump into our tests, in previous versions of Laravel, let me get rid of the sidebar for a second. This is kind of what that would look like to mock. So I have to mock, or say I want to mock the user service and not have it hit the database and just have it return some dummy user data. To do this in previous releases of Laravel, you would have to do mockery mock user service, get the mock, say mock should receive find once with 1, which is the ID we're going to be passing in, and return some dummy array of user data. And then once you did that, you would have to call this instance user service and give it the mock. So what this basically does is we mock the user service. Then we tell Laravel's container, hey, anytime you need a user service, actually just use this instance that I'm giving you, this mocked instance. And so every time, or when we call that route, we'll get the mocked instance instead of our database implementation. All right, so if we run this test, let's see, I'll run that. We get passing. And so to make this a little easier for you in Laravel 5.8, you can actually shorten it up a little bit by just saying this mock. And you still have to, of course, specify the expectation, but it does take care of calling mockery for you, and it also takes care of binding it into the container. Notice we don't have to call this instance. So calling this mock will automatically mock the object, let you customize the expectations, and then bind it in the container for you using that class binding. So it's a little bit more straightforward and a little bit less cumbersome to mock out stuff. And if we run that test, we get passing as well. So basically the same behavior. So use that. You can use that to clean up your tests a little bit, so you're not having to mock stuff and bind it all into the container manually. You can just use these mock and spy helpers to do it for you really quickly. All right, so hopefully that's pretty useful for you. This is another sort of probably even more drastic cleanup or life improvement fix. If you have a model that has scopes on it, and not global scopes, but actually my user model has these scope methods, like scope popular to get a user that has over 100 votes, scope active to get a user that's active and is updated in the last 30 days. And and you wanted to chain them together with or where conditions. So I want to get the user where the ID is greater than or equal to 1, or where the user is popular, or where the user is active. In order to make your conditions logic be correct, you had to chain them in these sort of callbacks to make Eloquent wrap those scopes in parentheses. So what it ends up generating, if we run this code, you can see I've got a DB listen here to dump out the SQL. If we go to this or where, you can see there we got where ID is greater than or equal to whatever, or votes, or active, and this. So the logical scoping looks correct. We've got these parentheses around these or segments that are sort of containing them. But it was just sort of cumbersome to have to do all this sort of closure nesting in order to get that proper parenthesis logic. So in Laravel 5.8, there was a community contribution that added this sort of higher order or where I can just chain on user where ID greater than or equal to 1, or where, immediately another arrow here, just calling or where almost like a property, or where popular, or where active, get. And that will basically translate down into this code under the hood for you, so that when we run this, we actually get the exact same query and the exact same results without having to use any callbacks or anything. So it's a much more expressive and easier way to get the appropriate logic on these where scope conditions. Sort of a complicated topic to talk about, but a really useful feature. So check that out if you're using scopes and you need to chain them together using ORs and you're in some kind of callback disaster. Give that a shot, and it should clean up your code quite a bit. All right, moving on to atomic locks. So atomic locks are something that have existed in Laravel. I don't know how well known they are, but they've existed in Laravel for several versions at least. And there were situations in previous versions of Laravel that were not totally safe with atomic locks, and you could have unexpected behavior, which has been corrected in Laravel 5.8. And I kind of want to walk you through an example of how the new lock system works and what they're used for. So to do this, I'm going to jump into routes console. And first, I want to talk about what was actually broken or could go wrong in previous releases of Laravel. So you could have a process A that gets a lock, and say it gets the lock for, it says, I want this lock for 30 seconds. Okay, and process A actually runs for a minute, and the lock system automatically releases that lock after 30 seconds. But the process A is still running, which so far that's not necessarily any unexpected behavior. Okay, so process B gets the lock because the lock is now available. Okay, and before process B can finish, A finally finishes. And then it releases the lock, but wait a second, it just released process B's lock, which has not gone over its time limit yet. And process C can now get a lock that process A incorrectly released that really belonged to process B. So it sounds complicated, but it's actually not that hard to get yourself into the situation in a real application. So what happens in Laravel 5.8 is each lock is sort of internally tied to this hash or this sort of token that informs us who actually owns the lock. And so how you interact with locks is just using a really simple method called cache lock. And what it does is it gives me this lock instance, and then I can try to call get. And if get returns true, it means I was able to acquire the lock. If it doesn't return true, the lock is already held by some other process, and I can't get the lock. And these are atomic, so you don't have to really worry about race conditions or, what if two requests come in at the same time? There's no way for two applications to get a lock at the exact same time. One of them will get denied. And that's just the nature of how Redis or Memcache work under the hood. They have these atomic operations. So if we get the lock, we'll sleep for 10 seconds. We acquired the lock with a limit of 30. So what that means is if our process lasted longer than 30 seconds, the lock would actually be released after 30 seconds, even if our process is still running. And then at the end, we will release the lock when we're done. All right, so to demo this, I can go into my console, and I should be able to do Artisan lock to try to get that lock. And if I go to another console and do Artisan lock, you can see this version was unable to get the lock because this one is still running and has the lock. All right, so that time it finished and I was able to get the lock from this tab. Okay, so far this is sort of all kind of similar to how locks worked before. The main difference is now you need to hold on to this lock instance because that's tied to that owner, and then you need to release it using the lock instance. Okay, so what about queued jobs? Because sometimes you want to get a lock in your web request, fire a queued job, and then the queued job will release the lock when it's done. So say an example of this might be something like Forge deployments, where you trigger a deployment on Forge. We want to get a lock on deploying this project, fire a queued job to actually deploy the project, and when that queued job is done, it will release the lock so more deployments can happen. Okay, so in order to do this, we need to be able to tell the queued job who actually owns the lock. And you can see we do this using this lock owner method. So this lock owner returns a string, which is just the token for who owns the lock, and we'll pass that to this locked job. So lock job is going to take the lock owner as a string, and at the end, we can do cache restore lock from using this lock owner, restore the foo lock, and then release it. So this lock owner string lets us prove that we actually sort of have the authority to release this lock, so to speak. And if some other process came in, for example, this release lock, and tried to release the cache lock for foo, before this finished, it actually would not be able to release because we don't have the token to prove that we're the owner of the lock. All right, so to kind of demo this, I'll go ahead and fire QLock from here, which is going to dispatch that job. And I'm not going to fire it yet. I'm going to switch to this tab, and I'll call release lock from here after that to try to release the lock, even though I don't have the authority. And I'll just try to kind of prove to you that that doesn't actually release the lock anymore. All right, so we got the lock, we fire the job, we try to release the lock. Let's try to fire another job, and we're unable to get the lock, even though this tried to release it because we didn't have the sufficient token. All right, so I'll start my queue to process that. It sleeps for a few seconds, finishes processing, and now we should be able to get the lock again. So the queue job was able to release the lock. All right, so anyway, that felt a little convoluted, but hopefully that shows you kind of what cache locks are used for and how they can be useful. If you have any sort of race condition situation where you definitely want to get an atomic lock and not let two things happen at the same time, the cache lock feature is sort of the feature you're looking for in Laravel, and it's improved in 5.8 so that it's very safe, and you don't sort of run into weird situations before where you can accidentally release locks. All right, so that is the new cache lock improvements in 5.8. A quick little demo before I move on to sort of my final example is there's been some improvements to Artisan Serve. I don't know how many of you use Artisan Serve. I personally use Valet a lot, but Artisan Serve is a really quick way to serve your application to where, like, you can do Artisan Serve. It serves it on localhost port 8000. Come in here, and it serves up the application. Now, in previous releases of Laravel, if I tried to then come into another directory and Artisan Serve something else, I would get an error that something's already on port 8000. But in Laravel 5.8, it will actually scan the ports and say, oh, 8000 is full. Let's use 8001. And it will go all the way up to like 8009. And so now if we hit localhost 8001, we get our application. So it just a little convenience feature so you can Artisan Serve multiple applications at once from your terminal. All right. So the last example I want to walk you through is the improvements to Redis blocking pop. And I wanted to kind of demo to you what an improvement it can be in terms of how much you're hitting Redis. So to demo it first, let's go into my queue configuration and go to Redis and then block for, I think we can do 0 or null. Let's try null. So we're going to turn off all blocking. All right. And in my Redis queue, in the framework, in the pop method, I've actually put a dump call here called pinging Redis so that we can see how often are we actually hitting Redis when we run queue work on the command line. All right. So if I do artisan queue work, sleep 1, you can see we're pinging basically every second. So sleep 1 tells it to rest 1 second in between pinging Redis. So we're ping, 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 ping. No matter if the queue's empty for hours, we just keep on pinging. All right. And then a sleep 0, it's even more drastic because we're pinging basically as fast as possible with no sleep in between. And that would pretty much crush out or drastically increase your CPU, I would imagine, if you're doing that. Now, in Laravel 5.8, there's actually an improvement where you can tell Redis to block. So I can say I want to block for 10 seconds. And what that means is we ping Redis once and wait for 10 seconds for any jobs to become available. And then we go through and ping again. So with changing that to block for 10, what this means is now if I come in and run artisan queue work sleep 0, you can see it pings Redis and it doesn't go as fast. It's actually going to sleep for, or it's going to block for 10 seconds and wait for jobs. So I'll give that 10 seconds. Okay, there you can go. So it's pinging really slow. So you might think, oh, this isn't a good idea. And my Siri just started talking to me. Anyway, you might say this, hey, Siri, stop. Anyway, so you might think, okay, what if a job comes in while we're blocking? What happens? And what's really cool is if a job comes in, let's go back to this tab over here and do this queue route, which is going to dispatch a bunch of jobs. Look how fast they execute. So even though we're blocking, that doesn't mean we're not ready to process. If I put more on the queue, they immediately get processed because Redis is just sitting there just like, give me a job, give me a job, give me a job. But we're not actually pinging it so fast, even though we can work the queue very efficiently in terms of CPU and memory usage and all that, and just not demolish our Redis server with tons of requests. So if you're using Redis for your queues, this is a really handy feature because you can see how slow I'm pinging it, but I can still process jobs really quickly because when we process a job, we immediately check again for another job and it can go really quickly. So if you're using Redis queues, definitely check out the blocking feature. This was sort of an experimental feature in previous releases of Laravel, and in 5.8, we've confirmed there's no possibility of you losing jobs, even if your server crashes, because everything is handled. We actually use Lua scripts to handle everything atomically, moving jobs around from waiting queues to active being processed to delayed queues, stuff like that is all using Lua scripts, which are atomic in Redis. So check that out if you're using Redis. Definitely a cool feature. And that is sort of the walkthrough I wanted to do for Laravel 5.8. I will hop out here to the speakers and see if anything's out here. Looks like there's quite a few. Laravel roadmap. I actually had in my notes to actually maybe mention this. I get asked a lot about a Laravel roadmap. Let me see what it says. What should we expect in 2019? Okay, that's a pretty good question. Sometimes they ask, what should we expect in 5-10 years from Laravel? And I think you'll find pretty consistently that in other open source projects, like even like Vue or React or something like that, I'm not sure they actually have a 5-year roadmap out there anywhere you could find on the internet. I couldn't find one for any other PHP projects that far out. I couldn't find one for Symfony for, even a couple of years. The thing we do know, is there will be releases every 6 months, and sort of what's in those features or what's in those releases is sort of all determined by community demand, by new features in PHP itself, by new sort of patterns that emerge in web programming. And it's hard to sort of predict 5 or 10 years out into the future what specific features will be in Laravel, such that like in Laravel in 2022, we'll have some new file upload feature in Laravel. Like there's no way to predict that. So every release is sort of taken as it comes, and we sort of evaluate the state of the product and the state of the ecosystem right then and determine what we want to do. Of course, there's always sort of big picture things. Like I'm sure all projects want to improve performance over a period of 5 years or make it faster or whatever. But in terms of very specifics, they're just not there. What is your secret project? That is a great question. Come to Laracon and hopefully I'll be able to reveal it there in New York. And we'll see about live streaming that event. I'm not sure, but hopefully I have more information on that there. Why is Laravel Horizon only compatible with Redis? This is another good question. And it's because with Laravel Horizon, we have the perfect with Redis, we have the only queue driver that gives us the perfect combination of total control over how things are queued, because we control all of the process of queuing it. Whereas with something like SQS, we just hand it to Amazon. It's totally atomic and scalable, and we don't run the possibility of losing jobs. And it's open source and free, basically that for you to install. But it's basically these killer combination of features that allows deep introspection, but also really powerful and scalable that only the Redis QDriver really has. So that's why Horizon is compatible with Redis. If you want something similar for other QDrivers, you can use Telescope, which will get you, at least let you see your pending and process jobs. I've never played with any non-PHP frameworks. So I've really mainly only done with Laravel since I started Laravel. Now, I did do .NET MVC before I ever came to PHP. I was a .NET programmer. All right, so that is my walkthrough of Laravel 5.8. I hope you enjoyed it. Try it. Give me a shout on Twitter at Taylor Otwell. And I also donated to the Digital Swag a 20% discount for Laravel Nova. So take advantage of that and get that nice admin panel for Laravel. And thanks a lot.